Hey, everybody. I think we're live. Yes, I believe we are.
Where are we?
I think we're live streaming on YouTube, I believe. I believe it's
Here?
10 a.m. Saturday morning from here to around the world, and also maybe some ships at sea, probably not.
Which would still
hard to
be
say.
around the world.
It would be. Anyway, I think this is an Agile thing. I believe I'm Matt Beam.
I know that I'm Mike Markey.
I'm not sure if I'm Jeff Singleton, but I've been acting that way.
We've got an hour to figure it out.
And hopefully we'll find some participants in our live stream mayhem.
Yeah, I actually posted this on LinkedIn yesterday for the first time. I've made it known.
I saw that.
And I shared it and posted it too. And got
And I
at least
saw
one like.
I saw that.
Maybe that was my like. I liked it.
Oh, God. I'm going to check to see if we're live. So what are we talking about today?
I think we're talking about the CIO's value stream management playbook.
Oh, yeah. That's right. Okay, we're live. Yeah, I saw this recently. There's a guy named Mik Kersten who wrote a book called Project to Product.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he's got a company called Planview. I think that's the name of the product as well that they sell or license. I don't know that much about it. I've never talked to Mik. I believe it is a way to manage portfolios and connect that to the output of the system and measure outputs and connect those to outcomes and make sure that you're... Anyway, do you have a healthy system that's actually creating value, I think is the problem they're trying to solve. And they just put out this PDF that I thought was interesting because it's rhymed with a lot of stuff we've talked about. And maybe it would be a good topic for discussion. Maybe useful.
Yeah.
Could be. Awesome. So where shall we begin?
Let's begin on page 4. I don't know. Should one of us share the PDF? I wonder, would that be helpful?
I can attempt to do that.
Let's see what happens when you try to do it. He's got like 12 different sections about different... I don't know if they're all as interesting, but go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, the 12 steps. As Mike is bringing that up, there is an operative phrase, a sentence, even before you get to page 4, where he talks about they outline 12 key steps to running a high-performance technology organization within a large-scale enterprise. And it would be easy to, think, well, this is for everybody. And I suppose it could be because the concepts are, I think, relatively immutable. But this is clearly targeted at high-performing technology organizations in large enterprises. So they're not talking about, your average startup or anything like that, with the presumption that, maybe they're doing this stuff already, or maybe they're not the market target for Planview. I'm just saying, but we know that value stream management is valuable regardless of whether you're in a small organization or a large organization. So.
No, I think that's a fair context setting. I mean, because you can use Agile principles and patterns a number of places. You can use them in not-for-profits. You can use them in different size organizations, but this is a specific application for, larger places with lots of money flowing through them and a lot of complexity. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the presentation's aimed at the executives. They're trying to get the very people we continually talk about as needing to be invested in what we're trying to do, and this is targeted directly at them, trying to speak the executive language in ways that they understand.
But also, in helping larger organizations, that tends to be harder, right? Because there's more in sort of stuff in place, culture, processes, right? Change is harder. It's a bigger ship. So, yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, should we go to the first one?
Is that
Drive business outcomes, have everyone measuring business value flow. I mean, maybe there's something to say on this slide.
okay?
I like the way that, excuse me, I like the way that they have divvied things up. 12 steps. I don't know whether steps means they're expecting you to do them sequentially, or in parallel, or whether they're iterative or it's a one and done. That's not very clear from this document, but I do like the fact that they've broken it into some steps, 12, and that even within those or outside of those, they've categorized them. And so it's kind of a nice, neat way to, I don't know, parse the stuff out. I don't know if that makes it more digestible or not, but I thought in general it was pretty understandable, pretty straightforward. So
Yeah, I think this makes sense in a sequential order. Like, I think probably the most valuable thing to do first is to start measuring flow. They've got that listed as first, and then connect that to the impact. Why would you have flow if it's not making a difference? I think those are probably the two most important things. Yeah. But
I like the fact that business agility, where it says true business agility, and it's just clarifying capacity, learning to say no, and making all work visible. That's true business agility from this perspective. So
yeah, but you can't do that until you can measure flow in the first place, which supports the idea of the sequential order. But yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of places where they don't really know their capacity, or they're overcommitted, right? So that's, yeah.
or even that what they're working on is valuable, or
100%.
to what extent.
Or they can't see all the work, so it's hard to see what the trade-offs are. Yeah.
I would argue that measuring true business agility may be a little bit more encompassing than just those three.
Well, maybe
But
they'll go into
to be
more
fair,
details.
those are good. But I think it in my mind, measuring true business agility should go beyond that, and maybe that's just it. This is a good outline, but there's much more to peel back, and the devil, of course, is always in the details. So it's easy to outline something, but now you got to actually do this. But it's a good start. So.
Yeah, maybe it's definitional. Like, how do you define business agility? I would say these things are necessary, maybe not sufficient.
For example, and this is one of the reasons why I asked or posed the question, is this supposed to be done sequentially? If you look at outpacing the competition, that's something that logically you focus on down the road. But some of the things that are part and parcel, addressing systemic bottlenecks. Well, I would suggest, just my opinion, that that's something you would want to do really early, not kind of near the end. And so if it's number 11, and if you're doing this sequential, and I'm not even suggesting that this does need to be done sequentially. In fact, I think it probably shouldn't be necessarily. I would say, though, 11 and 12, addressing the systemic bottlenecks and disarming dependencies, is something that you would want to do much earlier in the sequence.
Potentially, yeah. I guess it depends on how big the bottleneck is and the impact of the bottleneck. And, are the dependencies killing you, or can you wait to, there's some cases where, like, I'm thinking of a financial institution where they've got a big monolithic system that was built 50 years ago, and like what it means is that you've got all these dependencies on future, you know, the new teams building the new stuff have to manage their dependencies on this old system. And you're never going to get rid of those what you'd have to do to really get rid of those dependencies might be to take that monolith and break it up into microservices. But that's never going to make sense. The ROI on that so you're just going to have to live with them, right? So in some cases, maybe it could be number 12 to disarm dependencies. Or in other cases, it might just be there's a lot of new stuff that was poorly architected, and you can't get anything done without 9 conversations, and so maybe it has to be number 2. I guess I'm saying the consultant thing, that it depends, right? I agree with you. Maybe, depending on what your situation is. Yeah. Let's drive some business outcomes.
So the first one says drive business outcomes. There's 3 steps.
That sounds like a great idea. So this starts with measuring the value. So interesting. They don't talk about measuring flow. They talk about measuring business value flow, which strongly implies you have to know the value.
And so we used to do this. I would encourage teams, like when we got to sprint reviews, to say, don't talk about how much we did. Talk about how much we delivered. Talk about how much value we provided, right? Don't say we finished 3 stories. They don't care that we finished 3 stories. Say what those stories did. Tell the story. Tell the outcome. And
it's a difference between being busy and being effective, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, we were busy the whole time. What'd you finish? Nothing.
So you might as well have not been busy.
Yeah.
The outcome's the same.
Certainly
Effort doesn't count.
From a value perspective, you were not valuable.
Well, your activity wasn't valuable.
You were
your inherent worth as a person. It was not.
You were okay. I'm not questioning people's worth as an individual.
That's fair.
So, do you think that these are it says 3 steps? Do you think this is you start by measuring value, and then once you've got that, then you start doing step 2, then you move on and start doing step 3? Do you think this is a growth scale?
And this is the exact same thing that I was talking about is this truly supposed to be sequential, or even though they call them steps, they're really 12 concepts that need to come together? And I suspect there's probably a fair amount of overlap, and one doesn't necessarily have to be complete before the other. We start getting into that whole waterfall-y kind of model.
So I could see doing step 2. Maybe in a certain situation, you could do step 2 before step 1. But if you think about this is make sure you're measuring, right? Before you can change a thing or before you can determine impact, you have to be able to measure it. The second step is to see what you do, how it impacts that. And now once you understand what you're measuring and you understand what you can do to affect it, now what are the things we're going to do that are going to cause positive effect, not just any effect? That's the way that I read these.
Yeah, that would be my default interpretation. In practice, you'd have to be able to measure, because otherwise, how do you know that your experiments are successful or not? And how can you connect it to although I agree with Jeff, these are things that are not, these are components of a system that will interact over time. But in terms of practicality, I think I would do them in this order, at least, unless there was a compelling reason not to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That isn't to say that if they were already aware of how they were impacting the business, you wouldn't say, no, you're not allowed to think about that yet. You haven't figured out how to measure it.
Totally. Totally.
To that point, Mike, I would suggest also that even if they think they know how technology is impacting their business results, it's worthwhile taking the time to step back and reassess, because once again, as we've talked about assumptions and certain cognitive biases, it's easy to get into this is the way we've done things. We already know what our technology impact on business results are. Do you really? Maybe not. So it is worth taking that step and and re-examining, even if you think you know.
Yeah. I mean, I could make an argument that that's the reason why step one is step one, because one of the ways that we would revisit that and challenge it if necessary is to look at the objective measures and say, well, it's what I'm hearing you say is this, but when we look at the measurements, they suggest something else. At least it sets up the conversation.
So that's step one. Then step two, track technology's impact on business results.
Well, I mean, before we go on to step two, I'm back on step one. There's a couple of things. I'm interested in the language here. Sorry, Mike.
No, it's all right.
Yeah. So I highlighted, my version, I highlighted at the top right, flow time, right? Some people are going to know that as lead time, right?
Is
No?
it, or is it cycle time?
Honestly,
Can value traverse the network of yeah. Start
I
to
almost
finish.
think, I almost think that's the flow time would equate to throughput, because when you think about it, look at the measure key processes. One of them is, and I love this one, concept to cash.
Yeah.
And we talked about this last week. You know, how long does it take you to get from an idea to actually you get some money in the door from a
All right.
customer?
That is lead time.
That sounds like lead time to
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
And they're calling it flow time, which again isn't wrong. It's a different term though. So
Yeah, is this one of the safe adaptations of flow?
well, they use these words.
yeah.
I don't know.
Like flow time appears there now too. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm thinking maybe. And since this is aimed at larger organizations, they're probably coming along with a fair bit of safe.
So that's why I wanted to highlight it, because one of the things I see a lot of places is terms get overloaded and somebody says stuff like lead time or flow time and they have 3 different understandings. So it's worth clarifying. Yeah, flow time I think is lead time in other places. And Jeff, I think flow velocity sounds like throughput to me.
It does, but it's talking about how much value are we delivering. So it's throughput of value. Because, if you're measuring velocity, that tends to be size. We don't tend to size things in their value. Although I guess an argument could be made that you should.
You should. Otherwise,
Right.
you know you're being busy, but you don't know you're being effective.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a 7,000 point story.
Yeah. And thankfully, our customers are buying story points, so we're all good.
Yeah.
Certainly from a perspective of prioritization, I think it does make sense to be measuring in value, because you want to deliver things that are of higher value before you get to the little picky-uni stuff that, is not going to deliver as much value. So
100%. I do a user story writing class, and what I say is you want who, what, and why. The why speaks to value, and you're going to use that for prioritization. That's why you need to capture why we're doing it, because that will map onto value, and that's how you can confidently say we should do this ahead of this, because that's more valuable.
Yeah. Although that's still kind of the touchy-feely value concept. So I was just talking with somebody yesterday, and they were saying we need to have a quantifiable way of measuring value, right? And I said, well, what about a relative scale where you just say, I don't know what it's worth. This one's definitely worth more than that one. And he goes, no, too touchy-feely. I want numbers. I want to be able to justify. I want my business people to be able to justify the expenditure we're putting into these features.
He's talking about ROI.
Yes, by being.
Yeah.
And I said, well, have you got a way of measuring ROI right now? And so and the answer was, well, no, not a consistent one, not one that we can point to and say this is it. So.
And this is why we talked to Daniel Dwaron, I think is how you say his last name, from Montreal a few episodes ago.
That's how I say it.
About 3. That's how I just
But
said
then
it.
I say Jeff wrong. So
Yeah, that's right. It's
instead of Jeff.
That's Jeff.
Peanut.
Yeah. So the whole concept of throughput accounting, which requires a lot of setup in terms of how you're going to, but that's the idea, right? That you make a guess about what the value would be. So the other thing on this slide that I thought was interesting is the Jeff Bezos quote, if you're not watchful, the process can become the thing.
It pretty much does all the time, because that's tangible, right? We're talking about future work and things that have yet to happen and team cohesion and things that are not yet in place. So what can they touch? Well, they're
Yeah.
following the process. They're doing that.
It's also, I think, why the agile industrial complex has sort of collapsed is because we were selling process and not outcomes. We talked about outcomes, but we ended up installing process.
Shall we move on?
Yes, let's.
Let us move to step 2. Step 2, track technology's impact on business results.
I feel like this is where the rubber hits the road because we say, okay, here's how much you're doing in throughput, but what does it mean in terms of, well, if you've got at the bottom there, more value, less cost, higher quality, more happiness? Like that's the key link, right? Because, then you can, as a person who's responsible for ROI, you can confidently invest in this stuff if you can demonstrate the activity and the effect of the activity.
Mm-hmm. So they're measuring feature flow velocity in this chart compared to which I guess is the middle one, the flow velocity. So this is a measure of value delivered. And then so you've delivered value. That's theoretical. Then there's revenue, which is real. That's a realistic lagging response to putting the feature out there into the world or putting the value out into the world.
This is an interesting thing because the way I interpret this is feature flow velocity is the number of features put into production at a period of time. And so you think you have delivered value, but I don't know that you really know you've delivered value until you measure the revenue.
Right.
Because if people aren't paying for it, then is it really of any value?
Right.
And this has got to be net value or net revenue, not just how many dollars did you bring in. Because you're seeing revenue fall off, right? So at some point, so that might mean that your costs increase because you've been developing, but you haven't put it out there yet. But as you've put more and more stuff out there, and again, revenue is going to lag. It's not going to be a 1-for-1. So I could tell a story around that.
Yeah. To me, this speaks to the importance of being explicit and crisp in how these measures are defined, right? And I would think that directionally you want to measure in production, obviously, based on what real customers do as a result of what you've done. Otherwise, it's sort of assumptions and hopes.
I like that trend line. I think there's a potential flaw here. And so there are many factors that can cause revenue to go up or down. And yes, feature flow and the value delivered from that can conceivably account for an upswing in revenue. But there are other things too. And to the point Mike was making where there was a drop off in the revenue and yet there was an increase in the feature flow velocity. So it would seem to contradict that feature flow velocity is directly proportional, and it is not, to revenue. And it's because there's so many things that can affect revenue. What kind of economic environment are you in? You could be delivering good features that are of high value, but if you're in an economic downturn, you're probably going to see your revenue drop off, right?
That's a great point. Yeah, it could be there. So if you're in a seasonal business, let's say you have a hot dog stand between May and October. This is not a great example.
Yeah.
But if your feature flow velocity for the hot dog stand, let's say, is increasing in June, and also your revenue is increasing in June, it might just be that that's when people are buying the most hot dogs. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily the result of those things. So yeah, you have to still be sophisticated and isolate the variable, I guess, would be as much as you can, would be the way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay. Moving on.
Sure.
One other thing before we go, They talk about, and you got the little happy face
The
icon
happiness?
there. Yeah, the
Little
happiness.
happiness.
And I'm a big proponent of measuring happiness, but they don't say specifically whose happiness. Are you talking about customer happiness? Are you talking about employee happiness? Both? I don't know. I mean, I am curious about that. So,
Well, in terms of what the CIO would manage, I think I could make a strong case that they have to be focused on internal happiness. Because if you're depending on people to focus and problem solve and get into a deep work, you can't have people who are miserable doing that. I think we know that, right? So,
perfectly legit. It's just that it's kind of a generalization, and maybe that's the whole thing. This, as I said before, requires peeling things back and really understanding what makes sense in a particular
Yeah.
situation.
Well, you wouldn't want to look at this as this isn't a recipe.
Right.
This is
But how many people would read this and think, "Oh, this is what we've got to do"?
Oh,
Okay,
step two.
great.
All we have to do is focus on value, cost, quality, and happiness.
Yeah.
yeah.
Aces.
How hard could that
Yeah.
be?
And guess what they're going to do? They're going to focus on lowering the cost.
Lower cost.
Right.
It says right there there's a minus sign. So we want to lower cost. We want to increase value. We want higher thumbs. And we want bigger smiles. It's like,
More
it's a,
thumbs.
how much?
Bigger thumbs are known to be better. Yeah, the thing that I highlighted here was under clarify targets. Make it easy to determine when current flow is insufficient to support targeted business outcomes, right? So that's where you can say this team or this value stream is going this fast, but based on the revenue numbers we need or the happiness or the thumbs, right, we're not going to get there fast enough. That's where, you can actually start to steer the system based on this.
Well, profitability, adoption, customer satisfaction. I mean, if you're dealing with time-sensitive deadlines, you're dealing with regulatory environments, you may have dates that are set for you that you have to try to achieve. And if you're measuring things appropriately, you can look at it and say, we have insufficient flow to get there. We're not
Totally.
with the current situation, that time-sensitive thing is unachievable. Then it's what do we do and what do we do now? What do we do instead?
Yeah.
Do we bring more capability to the system? Do we have some way to increase our value flow? Do we decrease some of the functionality? Like maybe we cut down on some of the features that are in that absolutely must have bucket. Yeah.
100%. That's one of the reasons why I like flow metrics more than velocity, because flow metrics are like more scientific. You can make a forecast, right, based on probabilities, as opposed to, well, the team feels like they can do 50 points this sprint, but nobody knows what a point is, and it's generally more squishy.
I will say this: I have gotten teams to the point where we got reliable velocities out of them. I mean, over time, right? And we were able to use velocity moving forward because they were down with the whole estimation themselves. So when they looked at it, they were able to say, that's the kind of story we call a 5. And 5 is the point. When we say we can do a 5, we're confident we can get a 5 done. When they looked at an 8, no, they were not confident in an 8. They were super confident in 1, 2s, and 3s, right? But 5s were right on the ragged edge. And so when they looked at something and said, that's what we call a 5, then people would be a little bit more careful. Should we break that down smaller? Should we? And so over time, it forced people to try and think of things in smaller bits, because then we were getting more reliable responses. And so we were able to measure velocity, and that was useful moving forward. But that had nothing to do with whether or not the stories they were creating were providing value.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Velocity works as well to make sure you putting the right amount of forecast or commitment into the sprint backlog. The difference for me is like it's hard. I don't know how to do a Monte Carlo simulation on velocity, and so
and you shouldn't.
yeah,
No.
You
Yeah.
probably shouldn't.
Although I did, I ended up, I took a I took velocity. It basically, I knew how big a team was. I knew how many hours were in the team, and I would take this team as a snapshot. They did this much velocity, and it went, this is the rate at which they deliver a 1 point story on average. This is on a 2, this is a 3, and then added an uncertainty around it. Sometimes sometimes they're faster, sometimes they're slower.
Yeah.
And so I was able to create a range where I could say we could get this much stuff done at best luck possible speed, maybe by this date. At worst case scenario, way out here, but probably more in here. Right?
Yeah.
And that didn't make me feel better that we were able to establish a range, but I think because all that the people we showed it to ever looked at was the upper number, like the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
And so we said, all right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to disregard the best case scenario. Like, we're just going to show you the likely one and the worst case.
Yeah.
And because the odds of coming in under that, you guys are going to find ways to mess that up. There's no way that you're going to let them get the best case scenario ever.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm a brokered record on this, but I love how Flowmetrics gives you confidence intervals, and it says like 95% of the time the team delivers this many things. So if you need high confidence, keep your commitment or your forecast to that. Versus 50% of the time they do this many, which is a larger number, and so if you can tolerate that uncertainty, you can plan to that bigger number. Anyway, we don't have to beat this up.
All right. Continuously experiment to improve flow. So change everything every time.
I don't think that's what that means. So the thing that stuck out to me here and under the don'ts column is don't prematurely set OKRs with improvement targets.
I love that too, because how many of these don'ts, and especially that one nowadays, are violated?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
don't enlist metrics in a punitive manner. You're right.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
there
yet
are.
when we walk in places, we see every one of those don'ts is violated.
Totally.
Sorry, Matt, I stepped on you there.
No, I was just going to say, maybe this is the one you were talking about earlier. Should this go into a specific order, or should you be doing these continuously? This would be a thing that I would think, as long as you can establish the causality of what you did versus what happened, right? And you can sort of see the effects. You should always be experimenting as soon as you can, because by definition, the only reason we're doing an agile approach is because there's a lot of uncertainty, right? And we know that we don't know stuff that we need to know, but we don't know that we don't know what the thing is that we don't know. So you just have to focus on learning as quickly as possible. And the only scientific way to do that is through experiments. So anyway.
You know, the other thing is, I would add that, under the do's, encourage experimentation to improve flow. That sounds good, but it's not as simple as it sounds, particularly if your organization or any organization has a history of not being tolerant of experimentation or failure, or providing space for it. So you can say, oh yeah, we're going to encourage experimentation, but if all the other trappings of your organization box you into, stuffing more stuff, as we talked about last week, into the pipeline, or not giving space to do that, then I don't care how much you encourage experimentation, people aren't going to do it because they're averse to failure. They're afraid they're going to get punished.
Yeah.
To the whole point of the punitive use of metrics. So.
But maybe that's why the first one in there is establish psychological safety, which I think I know what they meant, but that's psychological safety, in my understanding, means if you talk about something or raise something, you won't be punished for it, even if it's a difficult or a challenging conversation. I think what they
But
mean is, yeah,
Yeah, it can't just be talk. It's
Mm-hmm.
actions too. It's trying things. Don't be afraid to try things.
yeah, this is what we. So maybe that's why the third one is sort of personal, talking to the CIO, establish, like, demonstrate. Leaders go first, right? This is what we're looking for. The other thing, this is nitpicky, but the dues are in red. You should start. You should go
Yeah,
forward.
that is
And
kinda weird.
I've been
They're
trained
important.
To, well, I've been trained to think of red as stop. So the association, I was confused.
Stop don't doing this. So
Stop stopping this stuff. Yeah.
interesting. Their whole logo is that way.
I think you can see, I used to be a technical writer, so I can see their theming is like the red stuff is lit, there's a hierarchy in the document design, but it's confusing to me, so.
The paragraph on the left, your role is to lead the cultural shift. So they're saying make sure managers are empowered to make necessary changes to the status quo. That kind of grates on me, and I'll tell you why. Because it's not enough to empower. And first of all, I'm almost weary of hearing that word empower, because, oh yeah, I bestow empowerment on you. Go forth and be empowered. It's not enough to empower managers to make those necessary changes. You actually have to ensure that there are underlying incentives that support that change versus sticking with the status quo. You can go forth and say, oh, you guys are empowered. And guess what? The masses are going to say, okay. Mm-hmm. And then they'll go back to their offices.
Sure we are.
Yeah, exactly.
But my bonus, I'm empowered, but my bonus is contingent upon me doing the stuff I would do if I wasn't empowered.
Precisely. And so if your institutional history is of non-empowerment, very high dysfunction, that's not going to happen overnight, and it's going to take time, but you also have to undo the underpinnings of that old culture. And so it's not as simple as just saying, okay, you're empowered. BS. You got hard work to do to truly make sure that your organization feels empowered. And to the degree that we're talking about large-scale organizations, how much dysfunction, how much disempowerment do we see? Well, they're rife with it.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I mean, I could see them saying, well, that's what we mean by empowered. It's all in there. But that's why it depends. And the consultant will say, look at your context. Yeah, I totally agree.
That's
Well,
the
they're
hard
talking here, though,
Yeah.
give teams a mandate to trial alternative tech tools. It's a mandate. You will try new things or else.
Yeah.
And you have psychological safety with which to do it. I have thereby empowered you to experiment under pain of death.
The mandating will continue until the psychological safety improves. Yeah, I have known people who would do that. Yes.
I told you to try new things, but that costs money. Don't spend money.
It reminds me of that Simpsons episode where Homer's yelling at the TV and he's saying, "Be more funny."
All right, so investing with intent. Who is intent? How do I know they're making good investments?
It's all about the interpretation. This is where rubber hits road, right? Like you actually start to steer the organization based on this stuff. It's another, I guess it's an argument for doing it in that chronological order. But
Yeah.
I thought this was interesting because they break out creating new value versus protecting existing value. And the two aspects of the product ownership, I think that's a valuable way to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, in terms of sequentiality, I would not say you have to do step 3 before you move into step 4 here. That seems kind of weird.
Yeah, I could make an argument for. Well, actually, I was looking
4
at step
parallel
5.
flows. I was thinking this was like 4 parallel flows.
Yeah,
Like your investment flow, which could have been a step 1, 2, 3, but I don't know. As we go through, maybe that'll reveal itself. So now that we know that there's detail slides, we don't have to do all our talking on the first one. All right, so
Now, the one thing, though, on the preview of this particular step, they do make a statement, as a key executive, you have the power to shift the focus from short-term gain to long-term value. Maybe. As we've talked about before, if the board, if shareholders will let you. It takes big balls or ovaries, as big as church bells, to work that long-term view in the face of short-term perspectives from the board, from shareholders, from analysts, investment analysts. And so you're trying to buck the trend in a large organization, of this short-term thinking. And so, to say you have the power to shift the focus from short-term gains to long-term value. Well, first of all, if you're the CIO, you don't have solely the power to shift that focus. Is it good to shift the focus from short-term gains to long-term value? Absolutely. But man, there are some heavy headwinds that they don't talk about there.
that is super interesting because we just talk about the incentives for individuals within the organization and how that's going to determine behavior. And it sounds like you're talking about what are the incentives for the whole organization, especially for public companies who need to be focused on the next quarter's numbers and how that will incentivize short-term value over long-term. Yeah, and how the CIO might not have, I mean, maybe they have power internally, but like that doesn't mean that the organization is going to go along with it.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Super interesting.
Okay. So visualize where investment is going.
Yeah, this is super interesting. So Mik Kersten talks about 4 categories. He talks about features, which he defines as new values. He talks about debts, like technical debt or other things that have to be cleaned up to keep the system running. He talks about risks, so compliance and governance and things like that have to be done. And I think defects is, stuff that isn't working is necessary. Oh, look, they're right there.
They are.
I
I was checking your work. Good job.
So a lot of places I've been, they have not known what their flow distribution is. And in some cases, the most common case I've seen is where they did have a lot of technical debt. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't see how much there was, and they couldn't tell that they weren't doing it. They weren't working on enough of it each cycle to get them to a place where they needed to be in the future. So that's the obvious case for doing this, making this visible.
So is there some reason, is it just happenstance that risks and debts both show up in the balance sheet at the same time?
In the balance sheet at the same time?
Yeah, like if you're looking at this chart, like they spend all their time on defects to begin with and very little time on features because they got so many defects that they're working on. And that continues for a while. And then they start investing in some of their debt, presumably technical debt. And maybe that's reducing risk. Maybe there was a risk that came forward. It's like if, Microsoft is going to end of life Windows NT or something.
Yeah.
Windows XP. So they had to invest in that technical debt. Maybe that's why they're together.
That's a great question. Honestly, the story of this, and we'll get to that on the next slide there's definitely a story to be told with this example. This feels like the story of a product with really shitty quality.
And a long history. It took a long time to get this bad.
Exactly. I would be super curious what happened to the left of this, right? Because somehow they got themselves into a point where they had to be mostly.
Oh, I know
fix
what
defects.
happened to the left of that. I was in an organization with that. That was when they ended up having so many defects coming out of testing, and being added over and over again to the defect management system. There were thousands and thousands of defects, and they had a quality goal that was you could ship as long as you had addressed all the criticals and highs, which means you could ship with medium defects. And so everything became, that is a backlog of medium and low defects, I'll guarantee you.
So let me ask the obvious question. Did this organization at the time have a way to see flow distribution and measure it? They probably didn't.
No, they were a time-based world. And it's
Yeah.
like the only way we can hit the timeline is just just live with the mediums. We can do that.
Yeah.
And then every time someone tried to make a high, there was an argument. Well, does this really fit the strict definition of a high versus a medium? Because I think we could live with this one. So anyway.
Yep. So that's why that is useful
Okay.
to be able to see what you're working on.
And so
yeah.
similar, same concept here. So go on.
So I was just going to say this example here matches, like, this is the life cycle of a new product, right? Initially, it's mostly new value, and you need some risks and defects. But as it goes through the stages, right, at the end where it's declined, there's not a lot of new features, but you have to fix most of the defects, right? So depending on where you are in your product life cycle, and right, what you think you'll need in the future, you might make different decisions about how many defects to fix.
Yeah.
Or how many risks to handle.
In the beginning, you have no debt.
Totally.
Yeah. I think this is an oversimplification,
Well-
because in incubation, particularly in smaller organizations or newer organizations, you have an idea. A lot of times in the effort to get to market faster, and we all talk about that, there is the trade-off, and you do trade technical debt for speed, and that's not represented here in that incubation. So, it's like, okay, maybe. And similarly on the decline side, is your product is on the back end of the curve there, and so you got a lot of defects.
I could offer a different perspective on this. I think that
Please
what this
do.
is a aspirational distribution of work. If you have a zero-sum game in the beginning when you're doing incubation, you're spending all your time on new features. You'll deal with the defects that come up, and you're going to be managing the risk of delivery. But that's where you should be spending all your time. You shouldn't be spending your time you don't have technical debt yet, right, in the incubation period, because technical debts are accumulated as a trade-off.
I mean,
Maybe this is just look at it and say, this is where your time should be going. You can't say you should be spending 25% of your time on technical debt when you're just creating a new thing.
So I don't know. I agree. I don't know if this is helpful or not, but remember they're talking about flow distribution, which means by default, this is stuff that they're actively working on. So I think in incubation period, they might be creating new items for technical debt, right? Jeff, to your point, like to get stuff done quick and dirty, and you'll have to refactor it later. You might be accumulating technical debt, but
Yes.
you're not working on it then, and so it's not represented in the flow distribution chart.
Oh,
This is what they want
All
you to be
right,
focusing
all
your
right, all
attention
right.
on, or where you're likely to be focusing your attention.
Okay.
Whereas when it's in decline, you're trying to get rid of all the defects, because that thing's going to, at some point,
Why?
It's a great question. It's almost dead. Why do you need to fix it?
you're not going to, a system that's in decline is you're just not investing in it anymore.
Oh, yes, and that doesn't mean that's a lot of investment in it, but what you are doing, the distribution and the investment, might be mostly defects because
Right.
you
You're
still
not
needs
adding
to
new
work.
features. Yeah.
Yeah.
You might have to respond to technology change. You might have to address some risks or things that are in there. But for the most part, all you're doing is you're keeping the wheels nailed onto the wagon. That's
And-
that's the whole point. And the wagon will run as long as the wagon can run.
And what you're definitely not doing is investing in new features and new value, right?
Right.
Because it's in decline. Yeah.
That's
Okay.
the thought. Okay. So that makes sense. There, we solved it.
Awesome. That feels good. So we're halfway through and we're coming up on our time box. I have to
Be that
pass.
guy.
I have
You've
to-
got to be that guy.
That's one of my roles. Should we wrap it up for this week? Next week we've got a guest. I'm not sure. I can't remember who it is. Might be Nigel.
Is it
Or no, I
Nigel or
think-
Josh?
no.
I think it's
it's-
Josh.
I thought it was Klaus.
I think it's Klaus.
Oh, Klaus.
Yeah.
Yes.
Klaus Leopold will be here next week to talk about flight levels, which is super interesting to me. So
Fantastic.
maybe we'll pick, and then after that, I think it's Nigel Thurlow to talk about flow as well. So maybe we'll pick this up in a few weeks.
Okay.
So that must mean something.
I think it means that this has been an agile thing, and I think it also implies that I've been Matt Beam.
I agree. It implies I've been Mike Markey.
And I'm Jeff Singleton.
We're certain about that. So thanks everybody for joining the live stream and or listening to the episode of the podcast that is edited from that. And we will see you next time.